Hi everyone, today I wanted to talk to you about the death current. And why am I calling it the death current using occult terms as opposed to just saying death? Because to me, I want to differentiate out these two statements so that you understand what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about what most people think of when they hear the word death, which would be the existential dread that comes along with the thought that one day you will cease to be, or perhaps you'll find out for sure if there's an afterlife or nothing in the end. That sort of thing is not what I'm talking about. I'm also not talking about the feeling of observing death. I'm not talking about going through the experiences of loss that goes along with someone dying. I'm not talking about seeing gruesome death. I'm not talking about the different tragedies of people dying. I'm not talking about any of that stuff. I'm not talking about that kind of death. What I'm talking about is the occult concept of death being a transition or a cycle of death and rebirth. And I'm not talking about that in a literal sense of dying and coming back in some kind of future or past life. I'm talking about it in a metaphorical sense, which is going through some kind of change that's so powerful that there's no way to go back to the way things were once you've gone through that change. That to me is the death current. I don't know what else to call it. I guess you could call it transition, but it doesn't seem to have the impact. Transformation seems more often to get people to think of some kind of actual physical change. And what I'm talking about is that change to the self when you go through something impactful enough that it changes you forever. And not just in some way that it impacts you for a while, but in a way where you can never go back. Now, death of a person can cause this in you. For example, my mother died last year. The death of my mother is something that will never be undone, so I always will have to live without her now. That's going to leave a permanent change of one sort or another. And that is why calling it death kind of has the right kind of implication to this in a way. It also is sort of a death of an old way of thinking and a birth of a new way of thinking. Sometimes when you're enlightened, as some other people would put it, you suddenly come to understandings that you've never had before, and you start to see things in the world that you never noticed before, and now they're ever present. You can't unsee it once you've seen it. And that is a permanent transformation. Once again, that is the type of thing I'm talking about with the death current. I'm also talking about the personification of death. In other words, gods, deities, things like that, that take on the presence of being a god or goddess of death, which tends to lean toward this kind of definition for death. They're usually either someone who controls the fate of your life, and when change happens, the ultimate change of which being death, or there's someone who can ferry you from one location to another, taking you through a transition after your life is over, or perhaps during your life as you change from one sort to another. And so this sort of language explains the concept I'm talking about. I would say, as a lot of people maybe use the term enlightenment more, they would say they have an enlightenment experience, and I think I used to use that term as well, but I kind of look at it more as like a death and rebirth process now, where the old you dies and falls away and the new you is born from that, and that process is usually not comfortable. Now, I've talked about the different incidents in my life where I've experienced this before, with this transition of the self and how much it's impacted me, and it's a process that goes on forever. It's going to continuously happen. It seems, if I trace it backward now, that ever since I got into the occult originally, about once every 2 years, I go through another major transition point. And for some reason, it seems like I'm coming up for that again. Now, recognition of these transitions could completely be psychological. It's entirely possible that I'm feeling this feeling again because I'm starting to mull over certain ideas in my mind that are coming together in a way where my subconscious is a bit ahead of the conscious on it and knows we're going through a transition time now. It's going to be another rough patch. Or it could be something more supernatural, if that's what you believe. I am not opposed to that view, even though it's just not my framework at the moment. Needless to say, I'm recognizing the familiar feeling of a change in my own personality that I'm going through right now. Some of it has been apparent just from going through explaining everything that's happened in the past few years here on this series. And if you're watching me on YouTube, seeing the transition of, as I become much more accepting of everybody, again, I've kind of found that inner self, that inner intuition that I was missing for a little while there, and I've come to grips with everything that's changed over the past 2 years. It seems almost like the process is accepting something, letting it become normal, expressing it to other people, and then a new change. And each thing builds upon the next. I don't believe this process requires belief in anything occult related. It just seems to be a process that some of us are on. I don't know why. It doesn't seem like it's just regular human nature. Maybe it's a personality thing. Maybe it has to do with doing it a few times and getting into kind of a rhythm of being able to accept this change. Maybe it's a matter of not pushing against the change when it comes, and so you're able to change more rapidly than other people. I see it more often in occultists than non-occultists, but I don't think it's related to the occult. Of course, I could be wrong about that. In either case, what's the new change I'm going through? I don't know. I haven't figured that out. I just know I'm feeling that familiar feeling of kind of dread that comes along with that transition, and I'm starting to have different views and thoughts about the world around me, but they aren't formed enough yet for me to really realize where they're going. There's just this shift happening, and I feel it now, and it's happening. And I think a lot of times in the occult community, you'll have people that will talk about feeling a shift in the world or something of this nature, and I think a lot of times that really coincides to their own transformations, things that are happening to them. I don't think it's necessarily a shift that's happening to everyone. I could be wrong about that as well. There's a lot of unknown elements there, but I feel like it's really a shift that they're experiencing inside. And of course, if it is a true death current style shift, you're never the same again afterwards. So it is impactful to you. There's nothing anyone else could say to you that would tell you that you didn't just experience some shift into a new way of being. In any case, I'm open to that shift happening, and I, again, don't know where it's going, but that's happening to me right now. There's something going on in my life where my mind is kind of adapting to some new concept, which I don't fully grasp yet. And maybe it'll be something cool, maybe it'll be something rough, I don't know. But in a similar note, let's talk a little bit about deities, personifications of death, and why is that valuable here? Because I pretty much just said everything I wanted to say about the death current, but why bring that up? Because many of you know I used to work with an entity called the Morgan that I now believe was a representation of my subconscious mind, but I felt that sort of presence again recently as if it was right here, right behind me, over my shoulder. This kind of feeling of this death energy, for lack of a better way to explain it, just kind of looming over me. Like change is coming and you need to make changes in the right direction. And it's a little threatening feeling whenever that happens, but it's okay. You know, I get it. In the past, I would have just been like, man, I've got this entity I'm working with now who's by whatever name that I happen to give it. But now I feel like that's more of a subconscious feeling. My subconscious is letting me know, yeah, this is happening, get ready. And so that's just how my world, the way that I interact with it, that's how it comes across to me instead of just a feeling or however it may be to someone else. I get this literal feeling of some death deity over my shoulder. A lot of learning about the self to me is learning about these tells. Like feeling that to me doesn't tell me there's a literal death deity over my shoulder. It tells me this feeling is meaningful in the same way it's been meaningful when I felt it before. But why bring up the fact of personifications of death? I keep getting away from this. So because of this feeling lately that I've been feeling, and a part of me also thinks that some of it has to do with the way that I've been behaving during this quarantine, where I've just been eating whatever I want, doing whatever I want, and stopped exercising and everything else. It's like, you know, this feeling of like, whoa, you're going in the wrong direction here. You're making a change, but your change is going the wrong way. So it could be related to that. It could be like a, hey, almost like a, you're gonna slowly kill yourself if you go this way. So back it up, pump the brakes, let's fix this. That has something to do with it for sure, but I'm not sure if that's the whole thing. But again, I keep digressing from the whole death deities thing. So when I was a teenager in the 90s, I had the same type of room every teenager in the 90s did. I had posters on the wall. Some were of different bands. Some were of different just conceptual video game type or book characters, things like that. Posters. But there was one poster that was right behind me at the head of my bed that was the one that I liked the most. And I think for most people, whenever they have a poster at the head of their bed, that's kind of their favorite poster. And for me, mine was a picture of the Grim Reaper. And a lot of people thought, man, that's a little bit morose. But I remember that when I was talking to my mother about it when she was like, why is this the one that you hang here? I said, well, this is kind of my protector. And I said it half joking, but it's funnier now. I said, this is my protector. Nothing scarier than death, so death will protect me while I sleep. Now, I didn't believe this as a kid, that death was literally protecting me as I slept. That's something that I might have slipped into the belief style of as an occultist later in life, and now slipped back out of, but that is what I said at the time, and it's very representative of how I felt. I was someone who feared death a lot, and as a result I saw death, or an incarnation of death, or a death god or goddess, as being the scariest thing you could have. So to make that a friend seemed like a good way to kind of circumvent this fear. Well, that's something that I forgot for a long time. I didn't get into the occult until much later in life than that, and whenever I started working with deities, the first one that really kind of stuck with me was Ishtar, and Ishtar for me was a goddess of war, a goddess of love, a goddess of fertility. Yeah, I think that's the thing she's mostly known for. And there's also Ishtar's sister Ereshkigal, who's the goddess of the underworld. But for me, when working with Ishtar, she came across as if she had a dual nature, as if the sisters were one being for some reason. And again, if you're an occultist or a heavy mythology buff who's like, that's not how it works, I don't foresee this as having actually worked with a spirit or entity now. I look at it as working with my subconscious. But the fact of the matter is that when you take those two concepts together, what you get is death and rebirth. You get a goddess of the afterlife, of death, of dying, and a goddess of fertilization, the growth of plants, life, who's also a war goddess, which will cycle back into creation and destruction. It's the two polar forces of creation and destruction, death and rebirth, the cycle. After working with that deity for a long time, the next one that I got really close to was Tiamat, as many people know, and Tiamat is the ancient Babylonian serpent goddess of creation and destruction, literally. And then the last goddess that I worked with was the Morgan, who is literally the death deity from Celtic mythology. So in retrospect, and again, I didn't really catch this at the time so much as I've caught it now that I started having this feeling over my shoulder that I was just describing again, I'm noticing that every deity that I worked with was, in a sense, a representation of this death cycle, death current, the cycle of death and rebirth. Each one was that same representation. And in fact, when I worked with the Morgan the very last time, and I've talked about this before, that she said to me that after this point, I wouldn't be able to see them as spirits anymore, it would change, which it has. I also asked her, and I don't think I've said this on any of my videos, but I also asked her if she was the same being as Tiamat. And she said she was, and that she was the same being as all of the goddesses I had worked with all the way back. And so that is in part why I've come to this belief that they were all one being. That's how it started, all one being. And now a further belief that they were all my subconscious mind. From reviewing psychology and things of that nature, from the fact that after going through the process of collecting what at that time I called soul shards, my lost past, and bringing it back together and accepting the self, that's when these deities stopped showing up for me. To me, that was a representation of pulling these conceptual parts of my mind back into oneself. And so it makes sense that she was the larger part of that, which would be the subconscious incarnated. And everything about Jungian psychology and the way the subconscious mind is supposed to work fits that model. But I didn't notice at the time that there's also this death current thing, that they were all kind of death goddesses, that they were creation destruction goddesses, that while I had accepted they were all the same being and that that being was actually a subconscious part of me, I had just kind of said, like, it represents my subconscious. And recently I started to go, oh, it actually also seems to represent that death current, that current of transformation, that change. It's the part of me that somehow is tied to that. And I don't understand it greater than that yet, but that's a realization I came to this week, which is why I felt like sharing this entire video. Now, this might have seemed like a ramble video, not a lot of new content here. I didn't try something new like I had originally thought would be what the next one of these videos would be, but I thought it had a big enough impact on where I'm going to also share with you all. And I'm interested in your thoughts on the death current, on this cycle of transformation, and what you think it might mean. Do you experience these transformative moments where things start to feel really grim right before there's a loss of some element of who you were and you change into something more, usually greater? Do you guys also experience that acceptance of the change is what allows it to happen, as opposed to trying to force yourself into a certain direction? I don't know. I'm just interested in your thoughts on that. If anything new comes of this, if I start to see weird shit again, whether that means I'm gone completely batshit crazy or whether I'm back into the entities game, I will let you know. If anything happens where I go through some major change and start to recognize this is what it was, I will let you know. But based on my past experience, it's more likely that you guys will notice the change in me before I know what it is. That my subconscious is way ahead of my conscious mind, usually. And so I'll start exuding this slightly different whatever it is, and it'll start coming out, sort of like in this video, how I'm like trying to formulate it. This is the early stages of some transformation occurring. And so you guys may be able to figure out what it is long before me. If you do, cool. I mean, I'm still going to have to catch up. Once again, I want to thank you for watching, and until next time, safe travels.